Thank you very much to Professor Pissarides for having set the scene so nicely. You came up on the optimistic side on automation, robotics, technological innovation. Actually, we had last year opposition talk between optimists and pessimists, and at the end of the day, I think the optimists got their largest support from the room. So you are one of them. You mentioned Maynard Keynes and what you disagree with. There's a lot to agree with. Actually, we are discovering the great master nowadays. But when he was talking about the economic prospect for our grandchildren, which actually is now, it's us, in a sense, he was talking his own way to inclusive growth, which is what we are talking about today. So thank you very much, Chris, for this great introduction. And now we move to a novelty in the Brussels Economic Forum. We start with a new TED Talk type, which we have dubbed Broader Horizons. It is the opportunity to indeed broaden our horizons and cast the net wider, try to bring fresh thinking to our reflection. So I'm extremely pleased to have today here Stefanie Stantcheva, who has accepted to kick off this new initiative. Stefanie is a professor of economics at Harvard University. She has worked a lot on taxation, innovation, but it's this new generation of economists which associate the, let's say, rigorous empirical analysis to an approach to economics which is actually broader than the classic ones. So I think very happy to have you here. You have worked on taxation, taxation and innovation, but also on the interplay between immigration, attitude to redistribution. So I think you are the perfect fit for the agenda of today. Stefanie is well known. She was this year actually named by the Le Monde and the Cercle des Économistes as the best young economist of the year. And last year, I recall that the Economist named her as one of the top young economists of the decade. So I think you have your credential, well set. Stefanie has a PhD at MIT. She was born in Bulgaria, but completed she lived in France. She moved in France when she was very young. She completed her degree in England at Cambridge, in France at the École Polytechnique, then MIT doctorate, and then Harvard today. I have to say a little anecdote. We had last week the Eurogroup meeting. And the Eurogroup every now and then deals with thematic topics. It was together with talking about Italy, ESM, and other less glamorous issues. And the thematic issue last week was on innovation, inclusive growth, and inequality. And the guest was Philippe Aghion, who is a colleague at Harvard of Stefanie. And in answering the round of questions by ministers, being put a bit under pressure, he told them, when you go back home, what you should do is to look at the papers by Stefanie Stantcheva, because there you will find the answers of how you design the tax system to foster innovation in a durable way. So I was very happy to see that we had the right intuition in inviting Stefanie here with us, and we are very happy she has accepted to kick off the Broader Horizon talk. A big applause for Stefanie. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Marco, for this very generous introduction. Thank you all for being here. I'm very excited to be giving this inaugural TED-style talk. So when I was asked to give this TED-style talk, I did what I guess we would all do, which is to go and Google, how do you give a good TED-style talk? And one of the top tips that comes up is try not to be too academic, which, for someone who's actually an academic is a great start. But I did not get discouraged, and I kept reading the advice. And the second big advice is focus on only one big idea. 15 full minutes, one idea. Wait, who really has time for that? I know you're all very busy people, hard-pressed for time. You're very smart and important. I want to make use of these 15 minutes that we have, so I'm going to try to offer you, all the brand new and exciting research results that I can possibly fit in. And so if you're ready, let's get started. If there is one overarching idea I would like to talk about today, it's that we need to listen more to people. And by we, I mean researchers and policymakers. And when I say people, I will mean all of us in our capacity as citizens across all the layers of society. And I don't mean this in an idealistic or wishful, open your hearts, open your minds kind of way. That's very nice too. No, I actually mean listening to people as a rigorous research method and as a tool, a new tool for science and policy. And that tool is surveys of people. Surveys means asking people questions directly. And how should these surveys be? Well, they should be, well-designed, well-calibrated, intuitive, clear, interactive, well-targeted to representative samples or specific groups. And they can be done online at a very large scale to get responses very quickly. And what can these surveys bring us? What's their value? Well, there are things which are intangible and that we really cannot see in any other data unless we ask people directly, even in this day and age of big data. And what are those things? Well, there's three of them. One is people's perceptions. Perceptions about others, perceptions of themselves, of the economic system, of economic policies. The second is people's views of fairness. What is fair? What is equitable? And the third is people's own economic circumstances. So these are very important things. Why? Well, first, when we decide which policies to support as citizens, these things definitely matter. Our perceptions, our views of fairness, and our own economic circumstances. And when we want to think which policies will work and how best to design some policies, these are also extremely relevant things. And the third, perhaps scarier reason is that there is a group of people that is already listening to people's perceptions and catering to them and pretending to offer solutions. And that's populists. And so we need to listen as well and hopefully offer much, much better solutions. Okay. So in this talk, I want to go through these three big topics and give you some brand new results from research, what we can learn from surveys about these intangible things, and what we can do more. So let me start with the first big issue. We need to ask people about their perceptions of others, of themselves, of the economic system, and of economic policies. So let me start with people's perceptions of others, and in fact, with a particular group of others, which is immigrants. So we did this large-scale surveys in 6 countries, eliciting people's views about immigrants. And many have suggested that, generosity, unfortunately, perhaps does not travel well across ethnic, national, and religious lines. And that part of the reason support for the welfare system as we know it is fraying is because people think it mostly benefits immigrants, and immigrants will, be the winners from it. But in fact, people have very, very inaccurate views about immigrants. So the first inaccurate view, which I'm going to show you with a little graph here, is what do people know about how many immigrants are actually in their countries? So these are the 6 countries in this study. And the blue little stick men and women show the actual number out of 100 people in that country who are immigrants. The yellow show the perceptions in that country. So you see that in all countries, people absolutely, starkly overestimate the share of immigrants. And it doesn't really stop there. People think there's way more Muslim immigrants than there are. People think immigrants are much more weak economically than is the truth. They think people, immigrants are less educated, poor, more likely to be unemployed, more reliant on government transfers, etc. And you may say, okay, but surely more educated people do not have, these misperceptions. In fact, everyone is wrong. It's just that some groups are more wrong than others. So people who actually work in low-skilled sectors with a lot of immigrant workers, people without a college education, and people to the right of the political spectrum have much larger inaccurate misperceptions about immigrants. But everyone is wrong. And why does this matter? Well, it matters because if you just make people think about immigrants before asking them policy questions, you see that people will support less progressive, less redistributive policies by just thinking about immigrants. So this is really, really important. The second big type of perceptions we would like to know is what people know about themselves. And people can be wrong about themselves too, about their economic position and their rank in society. So I'm going to tell you about a new study in Denmark. In Scandinavian countries, such as Denmark, there's this great ability to match administrative data, such as tax returns, to survey data. So we know both what people think, and we also know their actual circumstances. So we know in detail their incomes, the incomes of their neighbors, of people in their municipality, of people in their firms, etc. In case there's people from Denmark, fear not, this data is fully anonymous and non-identifiable. And so we can compare people's views about themselves, where they rank, to reality. And what do we find? Well, what we find is that the rich really overestimate how rich everyone else is. The rich really don't know how poor the poor are. And vice versa, the poor think everyone is poorer than they actually are. So the poor really don't know how rich the rich are. And when you ask rich people and poor people to rank themselves relative to others, rich people tend to rank themselves much lower than they truly are. And so this is very important because our own perceived circumstances really shape our views on policies. The third big issue for misperceptions is what people know about the economic system. And I'll tell you about a specific aspect that I just studied recently, which is what do people know about social mobility. So why is social mobility so important? Well, how fair we think the system is and how much equality of opportunity there is really shapes how much equality of outcomes we want or how much inequality we're happy to tolerate. We're okay tolerating more inequality of outcomes if we think the path to there was fair. Okay? And again, people have quite wrong views about mobility, actually. So let me show you here on this graph. On the horizontal axis, it shows you the true probability of a kid that's born in the bottom of the income distribution to remain in the lower quintile, in the lower bottom of the distribution when it grows up. And it shows you the average in each country. So for instance, in the US, around 33 kids out of 100 born in the bottom quintile will remain there when they grow up. In Europe, things are actually better than in the US. According to this metric, kids born at the bottom will have more chances of making it out. But on the vertical axis, I show you the average perception about that probability in the countries. And I've marked in blue, with a thunderstorm cloud, pessimistic, the upper panel, which shows you people overestimate the chance of a kid staying stuck in poverty. So that's, in Europe, people tend to be too pessimistic relative to reality about mobility. You can also look at the mirror image of this, which is what is the chance of the American dream or the European dream, which is really what is the chance of making it from the very bottom quintile to the very top. So that's shown on this graph. Again, the horizontal axis is the reality, and the vertical axis is the average perception. Here you see that, again, European countries are mildly pessimistic, and the US is really over-optimistic. In the US, this notion of the American dream is really very salient in people's minds, although it may no longer be a reality. And so people really overestimate this chance of making it from rags to riches. Okay. What about the other final fourth type of misperception, which is about economic policy and misunderstanding of it? There's a lot of economic policies which affect us in everyday life: tax policy, trade policy, health policy, and yet, we often misunderstand them and may support or oppose policies without truly understanding the implications on ourselves or others. So there is work on that too. And what we can see, for instance, just to give you a few examples, people tend to starkly underestimate the income level at which the top tax rate kicks in. So they think the top tax rate affects many more people than is actually the reality. Similarly, for the estate tax in the US, people think that 40% of all estates pay the estate tax, when in fact the reality is 0.7%. And so they think moderately wealthy people already pay the estate tax, that many small businesses and small farms pay it, which could partially explain, the strong opposition against the estate tax. And just telling people the reality increases support for this policy. Similarly, one thing which we may all be confused about is who are top incomes? Well, we tend to think, according to survey data, that it's a lot of entrepreneurs, the Elon Musks, Mark Zuckerbergs of this world, that it's a lot of stars in the media and sports, even scientists. No, I wish. But in fact, we tend to underestimate the true share of managers, executives, lawyers, doctors, people working in finance. Okay, so there's a lot of misperceptions that people have, and possibly shaping their views on policies, and that we could potentially correct with better information. The second big issue that we should ask people about is their views on fairness. And people have quite complex views on fairness. What is fair, what's not? Without asking, it's very hard to know, because it's complex and it's context dependent. And so what do we learn about views on fairness from all these surveys? Well, we learn a lot. I'm going to restrain myself to just 2 examples, and by introspection, see how you feel about these issues. So contrary to how our tax system perhaps acts in reality, people tend to think that it's fair to tax away an income that was not earned through hard work. For instance, if you get passive returns on a fortune that you have, if you inherit wealth, it's fair to tax that than someone who's been hard working for their income. If you got lucky on the stock market, then it's much fairer in people's minds to tax that away. Another big fairness consideration, and which shows the complexity of this, is, do people think the estate tax is fair? Is it fair to tax inheritances and bequests? Well, it's quite complicated, actually. Because if you ask people, is it fair that parents can give their wealth on to their kids? Most people will say, yes. These parents saved. They worked for it. If you ask, is it fair that kids start with different wealth and incomes in their life? Most people will say no. But these are, 2 sides of the same coin. So clearly, we need to ask more, we need to understand more, and come to some agreement. So the key is to understand these fairness perceptions so that we can aggregate them through a fair policy debate. And the final big thing that we should ask people about is their own economic circumstances. And to be very clear, there's a lot of things we can see in other data, which I will call non-survey data. What's this data? Well, administrative data sets, tax returns, social security records, retail scan data that shows people's purchases, etc., etc. There's many other data sources, and we can see a lot of things there. What I'm saying is we should also use survey data to see the things which are really invisible in these other data sets about people's economic circumstances. I'm going to give you 2 very concrete examples to make this clear. The first example comes from the US, and I truly hope it's irrelevant for Europe. Which is that in the US, many parents don't have generous enough health insurance or no health insurance. And so when their kids get ill, especially for kids with serious conditions, they sometimes wait in the parking lot with the kids in the car next to the emergency room, to be there in case things escalate, but to not have to pay in case things are okay to go into the emergency room. So if you look at health records, that's, for instance, one type of non-survey data, what you would see is that, well, kids go to the emergency room when it's warranted, all seems fine, right? But this would be very hard to figure out if you did not ask doctors or parents directly. You would never know what happens in the parking lot and the huge cost in terms of time, worry, risk taken in this situation. Another example, perhaps closer to home, is fuel taxes and carbon taxes on households. Proposed in many countries, implemented in some with big consequences. A fuel tax, economic theory says, will do its desired job, which is to reduce fuel consumption, only if people can switch away from fuel, right? If they can switch to alternative modes of transportation, for instance, like to the bus. And so if you just look at transportation data, you may say, great, there's a great bus network in the city, no problem to have a fuel tax, people will switch. But if you survey people, you may soon notice, well, the bus schedules stop before the night shifts start for night workers, or people need to also drop their kids off at school at the same time with some complicated route, or the doctors live way outside of the bus network, etc. Another thing you can say is look at the transport data and say, well, nobody's switching to the bus. That means the fuel tax is too low. We should increase it. But when people cannot respond, such a tax that's supposed to be corrective becomes a pure negative transfer from people that hurts people. And so the right answer would not be here to try to increase the fuel tax, but the right answer would be to try to understand what are the constraints that prevent people from switching. And to be clear, climate change is such an urgent issue, and we need to so urgently take action for it, that perhaps the direct way of trying to directly go and understand the situation is the quickest, most effective way that could, prevent us from reaching misleading conclusions if we do not use survey data and ask people. So, I want to end again by reiterating that I think we should listen more to people, we as researchers and policymakers, and their perceptions of others, of themselves, our economic policies, of the economic system, their views on fairness, their own economic circumstances. And surveys are a great tool for research and for data-driven policies. Because if we don't listen, others will. And those are populist parties, and they pretend, to understand these concerns and to cater to them, offer good solutions. But if we use survey data, in addition to our other tools and data, survey data on how people think, feel, and live, I think we can propose much better policy solutions. Thank you very much.